This question is brought up a lot. And quite frankly, a lot of people say, oh, I don't want to take history class. And so we need to answer this question. Why would you study history? Why should you? Why are you, in some cases, required to take the course? And in order to do that, we're going to focus on this question of we weren't there, or the statement, we weren't there. And that's going to lead us into several other things, and it's going to help us answer this main question. We'll put some exclamation points at the end there. Okay, so here are the answers. The answers to that question. Why should we study history? Why should you study history? Well, we, you, and I, that's we weren't there. We were not present when 99.9999999 things in history occurred. The people who wrote your textbooks weren't there either. Maybe some of them were there, but if you really think about it, the earliest they might have been born, let's go really far back, maybe like the 1930s, just maybe. Okay, and sure, we read books from people who were alive farther back than that, but the overwhelming majority of people who are writing textbooks and most history books weren't alive at the time that the things they were writing about happened. So if that's the case, we weren't there, neither were the people who are telling us about history. That means that we have to teach ourselves how to figure out what happened or how to discover the truth. We have to try to get close to it. It's unlikely that we'll ever get close to it. I take that back. It's unlikely that we'll ever figure it out for sure, but we can get really close to it. That's what I was trying to say. Okay, and we're going to do this using a variety of processes. So when I say processes, I mean things like analyzing sources, things like looking for patterns in history, things like looking for causes and effects, comparing, all these sort of, the AP would call them historical thinking skills. It's cause and effect relationships, historical thinking skills. We're going to use all those things. We're going to corroborate. That's one of my favorite words. Corroborate sources. There's all these processes we can use to teach ourselves how to discover the truth, put that in quotes, about what happened. Okay, and so that's going to all lead us to this statement that we weren't there history. This is the statement we're going to live by. It helps foster this term. I don't want to do that. Dang it. That screwed everything up. And that's all going to lead us to the statement, this idea that we weren't there. So it's our job to try and figure it out. This concept, this we weren't there, helps foster inquiry. Okay, so if we admit this, if we realize this and understand this idea, then it helps us kind of go, well, I wonder what did happen, or I wonder if we can figure it out. And so that idea of inquiry, that concept of inquiry is really, really important as we study it. We want to stir up kind of some curiosity in our brain where we dive into the reasons why things happened, how they happened, and that sort of thing. Okay, so let's go from there. Before we get really into the skills that we're going to use and the processes we're going to use in this concept of we weren't there history, let's look at some of the cliche answers to that question of why study history. This is one of the most common. You guys have probably heard this before, but many people say that you need to learn history because if you don't know it, you are bound, or sometimes you are destined to repeat it. And that may be true in some sense. I mean, sure, we learned that in World War II, the dropping of the atomic bomb caused a lot of destruction, very, very dangerous, and we haven't used it since. Now, one could argue that we built up such a nuclear arsenal, the world has built up such a huge arsenal of atomic weapons that that's actually worse than having just a couple of bombs and dropping them. But we can certainly say that we learned a lot when those were used, and we learned about the devastation they caused, and we haven't, thankfully, seen them used since. But more often, the answer to this statement or the response to this statement is the opposite. It's, well, we learned about these things, but we're still seeing them happen again. Let's take something like genocide. Um, to respond to this, or to kind of counter what this statement says, we could ask the question: if everyone learned about the Holocaust, would there be no more genocide? And we saw, in only a few years apart, in the early 1990s, a time where a lot of people had been taught about the Holocaust. We saw two very bad instances of genocide, of ethnic cleansing happen. And so to say that we're bound to repeat it if we don't know it, well, we did know it, and it still happened. So I think it's a bit of a bit misleading if we were to say you don't know your history, you're going to repeat it. There's lots of things that have occurred that have already occurred in history, and so we could teach the whole world every single thing that's ever happened in history, and we'd still see bad stuff happen. So that answer to the question doesn't work if you ask me, IMO, as we like to say. Let's go to these other statements, kind of cliche statements about history. So it makes you patriotic, or it makes you a better American. Well, what about the bad stuff? Bad stuff, like slavery and treatment of Native Americans, really since the arrival of Europeans. This was at Wounded Knee, a key event that you will study in American history, or you should study in American history, U.S. history. So if we look at this concept, well, if you know your history, you're going to be patriotic. Well, that's a tough statement to back up or support, because how do we reconcile, if we consider being a patriot or being patriotic, meaning being very proud of one's country, supporting it, and I'm not saying being a patriot is bad. I'm not saying that at all. But if we were to say that knowing history makes us patriotic, well, what about, I guess I missed my why there. What about these things that are really, really hard to reconcile and are unjustifiable? We can put these things in context and really understand why people did them, but at the end of the day, they're wrong and they're evil. And so it's really hard to learn these, unless you want to leave these things out, which would be a terrible study of history. Without studying these things, we're missing out on big pieces of history. So unless you leave that stuff out, it's really hard to just say, well, knowing history makes me really, really love our country. And we should love our country, but we also have to acknowledge that there are many bad things that have occurred, many evil things that have occurred in U.S. and world history. You can't look at the world. There's atrocities across the globe, some way worse than these things. We just talked about the Holocaust. So that's a tough one to justify. Now, this idea, it makes you a better citizen, same thing. It will make you a more informed citizen, but the idea that you'll be more patriotic, that you'll be a better American, a better citizen, that's hard to justify. Let's look at this question. How do we define patriotism? What is a patriot? Is it somebody who supports government at all costs, or supports the U.S. government, or just any government at all costs? Or is it somebody who, in the case of America, supports liberty? Or if you're talking about across the world, maybe a place that doesn't have as much liberty as we do, you could say supports the ideals of the country or the values that it was founded upon. So what is a patriot? So if knowing history makes you patriotic, well, what is a patriot? Well, some would say a patriot is being loyal to the government. Some would say being a patriot is being loyal to our values. I took this off the internet. I think there's some editing done here. See, this is close examination of sources. But I like the image, and it comes from a time when the U.S. was silencing, or I should say the government was silencing anyone who spoke out against the government during wartime. In World War I, we had things like the Espionage and Sedition Acts, and we had the unrest during Vietnam when people were protesting. We had all sorts of instances where our liberties, in this case freedom of speech, were taken away in the name of national security and patriotism. And so some would argue that you're more of a patriot if you hold closely to these ideals and fight against that sort of thing. Some would say you're more of a patriot if you support your government. So that's a really tough statement to attend to, because if we study history to be patriotic or to be a better citizen, well, I'm not even sure we can define that super clearly, especially when you go back and look at our history as a nation. Lastly, and this will be quick, but some people say, study history so you can know historical facts or be a history buff, and that's so one-dimensional. That might get you on Jeopardy. That's Ken Jennings playing a computer, Watson. He's designed by IBM, and it was interesting when this happened. The computer won handily. However, the computer struggled with questions that required kind of abstract reasoning, like questions that had clues within a clue, or were kind of wordplay type questions, because really the algorithm that was put into Watson the computer, or programmed into him, was it was limited, and he could come up with facts at lightning speed, or concepts at lightning speed. But when there was something a little off, or something that required a little bit of kind of outside abstract reasoning, he couldn't do it, or I should say the computer couldn't do it. I wasn't a person, so the computer couldn't do it. Ken could, and so could Brad. Brad's another historically good Jeopardy player. And so again, knowing facts is pretty one-dimensional. What we do in history, in any history course, what you should be doing is learning #skills for life. And I talked before, how do we do that? What's the point of studying history? How do we do this? Well, we discover things, we draw conclusions, we identify claims, we interpret and use information, and we do all this because we weren't there. And so we're making our own discovery. We are essentially teaching ourselves. We're essentially teaching ourselves what happened. Okay, we're teaching ourselves what happened. Okay, we'll learn how to draw conclusions using evidence. We'll learn how to identify a claim or an argument, which then helps us to decide if that argument is strong or weak. You got to identify the argument before you can say it's good or bad. Somebody could say that the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was essentially made things better for minority groups, especially African Americans. Say it's successful, it ended Jim Crow. That could be a very measurable thing. Ended, you'd say, racist policies. Sorry, I missed my space there. You could also argue the opposite, and you would have evidence for both. That you could say that it didn't make a lot of progress, or only small progress toward, we could just say, equality. Okay, that's a hot topic, one that's been kind of at the forefront of some of the current events of 2020. And so both those arguments could be made. You could have historical evidence that shows that it successfully ended racist policies, things like Jim Crow laws. But there's also historical evidence, especially from years after the civil rights movement, that it really didn't make enough or significant progress toward equality. And again, that took time to see that, but you can make a strong argument either way. There's evidence for both. So we identify a claim, and then we're able to describe it as strong or weak. Okay. Next thing, how to interpret and use information. That is probably the most important skill, because everyone has so much info coming at them every day. We've got TMI, too much information. We've got too much social media, notifications, 24/7 news. We've got so much info coming at us. We have to know how to interpret it. Let's do a very, very quick and general look at how we would use these interpretation skills, these analysis skills. So I've got two articles here talking about a fairly benign topic, and that is the college football season. We've got a article from CNN, and obviously I've clipped the headlines and then clipped just a small section of the article. We know that CNN is negative toward Trump, President Trump, and this is August 2020. So if you're watching this video years from now, we're looking at August 2020. We know that Fox News is, I almost wrote CNN again, is usually positive toward Trump. And so we know right away that what this article says is going to try very hard to make Donald Trump not look good in his decision making regarding college football. And we know that this article is going to try to make him look good in terms of his decision making for college football. And so I read here very quickly that it shows that he's ignoring consequences. I see some things that are really meant to make him look bad. He's not providing scientific evidence. Let's see, the article uses a tweet here, a quote from Trump or a tweet from him. That's the information they're using. He says, let's see, blah, blah. So this is arguing that the college football can't go and that Trump will be a failure, or he already is a failure, and that will continue if college football does happen. If we jump over to the other article, we see that, oh, look, the same tweet is used. We see that they say President supports college football. He acknowledges the coronavirus pandemic. We also see that he used somebody else's words. So Trump quote tweeted Clemson quarterback Trevor Lawrence, who's a very well-known athlete, very good athlete. He's a very prominent program. And he issued a statement on the issue. So Trevor Lawrence must have said something about wanting to play, and Donald Trump quote tweeted it. But we see that both articles use the same Trump tweet. So what we can do is we can go, well, we do know this. Trump wants college football, CFB, college football, to happen. Okay, we see that. That is something that between the two articles we know to be true. And so let's say, oops, and I want to circle the whole thing. Let's say we're 15 years away. Let's say it's 2035, and we're trying to write a history of the year 2020. We can say for sure, based on this evidence, that Trump wanted college football. But in that quick little bit there, I was able to use my historical thinking skills to kind of break through the negative and break through the I don't know that I see anything overly positive, but there's nothing super negative about it. To break through and find something that we can say objectively, and that is that Donald Trump wants college football. Now, CNN argues that that's a bad idea. Fox News argues that it's what players want. Interestingly enough, both use the same tweet. We learned from this that there is at least one college football player who's in support of playing football. So if there's one, there's probably more, but we don't know that it's all of them. And we don't have any evidence here that shows that the pandemic is really bad. We are introduced here with some ideas that the pandemic is bad and it might be a really bad idea to play football. But we don't have enough evidence to make any big conclusions. That might have been in the rest of the articles. I don't know. But I do know, I read them, but for our sake here, we don't know that, but we can take this one thing. So that's one way that we find some objective information in a world where it's really hard to find that because everybody's got a point of view that they want to push. And so that's one way that we use our history skills to kind of sift through the huge amount of information we have coming at us each day. Headlines, news stories, social media tweets or statements or pictures or whatever. But there's a lot of that stuff to get into later on. So hopefully that clears up why we study history. We will explore some of those other skills in other class periods and episodes, so that hopefully gives you a clear picture of where we're headed with We Weren't There history.